Today on the HopeFilled Financial Podcast, I'm going to tell you about the most expensive hobby that I've ever had. For our budget tip, we're going to be discussing how you can integrate your hobbies into your budget. Our question of the day asks if it is wrong to be wealthy. And for our main topic today, we're going to be ranking the frugality for America's top 10 hobbies. Be sure to stick to the end to find out which hobby is number one. Good morning and welcome to the HopeFilled Financial Podcast. My name is Jay Disberger, your one and only HopeFilled Financial Coach, and happy 4th of July. For the first time on the HopeFilled Financial Podcast, I have foregone the iconic bow tie and gone with a traditional tie. This one in particular features a steam engine and red, white, and blue smoke coming out of the smokestack there for the steam engine. It's a tie that I got from my dad before I was really into bow ties, and it's something that I thought would be more appropriate since I don't have a red, white, and blue bow tie. Bow ties are something that I've collected for a while. You could consider it a hobby of mine, but it's far from the most expensive hobby I've ever had. That's going to be bowling. Bowling is a uniquely American sport. Bowling originated as a yard game called kegling. You would take a ball. It's kind of like yard bowling, but it was a little different. And the idea was to knock over the kegels. Throughout history, it eventually developed into something known as 9-pin bowling. We're talking really early America here. 9-pin bowling became incredibly popular as a pastime, as a sport, as a hobby for early Americans. But it also came with this bizarre draw to gambling. Now, the federal government saw gambling as something that would be toxic for society and something that they needed to purge. Because it was almost impossible to separate 9-pin bowling from the gambling that's associated with it, there is a federal law that was passed that simply outlaws 9-pin bowling in the United States. As a result of this, you had a whole bunch of bowling houses, indoor bowling houses that had the wooden lanes and everything almost as you know them now, naturally no machinery. But what were they going to do with these if 9-pin bowling is illegal? Well, innovative Americans classically simply worked their way around the law by adding a 10th pin. And they moved the pins from being in a diamond shape to being the triangle shape as we know them today. So that's where 10-pin bowling comes from. And the federal government was like, well, if we outlaw 10-pin bowling, they're just going to add another pin. So we might as well just let it go. We can't take away their bowling in order to prevent them from gambling. And if we took it away, they'd just find something else to gamble on. Gosh darn it. And gambling is still fairly closely associated with bowling today, but that's not why I was into bowling. I was competitive. I was wanting to be a semi-pro or even professional bowler back when I was in high school. I had joined a league when I was 14 and was given my first 2 bowling balls. At the time, I didn't realize how much of a gift those were. Shout out to Shane, my bowling coach and the operator of Burning Mountain Bowl back when it was still a bowling alley. That bowling alley's been converted into a church since then. I've actually been to a wedding there. I digress. I got into bowling. I got my first 2 bowling balls gifted to me by Shane, and I didn't realize how expensive they were at the time. His hand roughly fit mine, so I didn't need to re-drill them or anything. But as I got more bowling balls, it occurred to me that a new bowling ball ran somewhere between $200 and $300 by the time you got it drilled. And you need a lot of bowling balls to do bowling. If you ask almost any league bowler or tournament bowler, hey, how many bowling balls do you need? They're probably going to tell you one more. And that was the thing. You always needed one more bowling ball. And they were coming out with new ones that did different things. The weights were different. There's a lot of science that went into bowling, and it was addictive to my nerdy brain. It was like the perfect blend of science and sports, but it got expensive. Bowling is not something that you can just practice at home. And if you want to go and you want to practice it, it's not going to be free. It costs money to go bowling on the regular. It costs money to join a league. It costs money to enter into tournaments. So there is an investment for bowling. I had 10 bowling balls at most, even though I'd only take 6 or 7 to any given tournament. But that begs the question, is bowling something that I, as a financial coach, in hindsight, would consider to be frugal. Well, I don't think it's necessarily frugal or unfrugal. I think there's a propensity for bowling to be frugal. It's always going to cost money. Now, I can't, in general, rank the good or the happiness, the joy or the utility that somebody gets out of a given hobby. So if I'm looking at bowling as a hobby and I'm looking at the frugal level that bowling could be, I have to look at the overall expense. I'm going to say that bowling is probably less frugal of a sport than doing something like soccer. For soccer, you need cleats and you need a ball at a bare minimum, and you can go out to a soccer field and kick a ball around and practice for free. You can't do that with bowling. You're going to need shoes. You're going to need multiple balls. At a minimum, you need 3 bowling balls, in my opinion, if you're taking it really seriously. And every time you practice, you got to put some money forward. So I'd say soccer is more frugal than bowling, but that's not to say you can't go about bowling in a frugal way. I did buy a number of bowling balls used, and I leaned on gifts, and I did my best to go about bowling in the least expensive way possible. And it was still an outlet for physical exercise, and it was still a way that I could earn money. I earned scholarships bowling those tournaments. So there was also a return on it. I don't know if I would have had that same opportunity as a soccer player. I didn't have talent when it came to soccer, but I was decent at bowling. The biggest tournament I ever bowled was the 2013 USBC Youth Open held in Detroit, and I ended up averaging 215 for that tournament. I recall being ranked in, I think, the top 12 or 12.5% of scratch bowlers under the age of 20. And that was sort of my peak when it came to bowling. As of late, I haven't been bowling as much. I'm currently not in a league. I haven't bowled in a tournament in a number of years. And I sold most of my bowling balls that didn't end up split in half. Thinking about bowling as a uniquely American sport, or hobby, if you will, got me thinking that for the 4th of July to celebrate, our main topic should focus on the top hobbies in America and how frugal they can be. But before the main topic, let's jump into today's budget tip. Today's budget tip is, if you have a hobby, if you have hobbies, plural, make a line item in your budget for each and every one of them. If you don't include a specific line item calling out a hobby that consumes any notable amount of money, you run the risk of overspending another line item in your budget without knowing it's necessarily your hobby that's consuming that money. And knowing how much you're spending in your hobby overall for the year is going to inform you if you are exercising your hobby in a frugal way. If the money that you're putting into your hobby starts to feel painful, if it starts to hurt, well, that might be a sign that you're not getting your maximum happiness per dollar. And if you find that your discretionary money is going to other things, but you wish you could be spending more on your hobby, and you're not spending that much according to your budget, well, giving yourself a separate line item gives you permission to really dive into your hobby a little bit more than you may otherwise give yourself permission for if you're a natural hardcore saver. Now it's time to answer a question submitted by you. Today's answer comes from Chris. Chris asks, is it wrong to be wealthy? Shouldn't I give it all to the poor? Is it wrong to buy a nice house or a new car? All right, Chris, your question comes with a little bit of a premise that's not quite stated, and that is, shouldn't I give it all to the poor? That, to me, implies that you're coming from, at least in my knowledge and experience, a religious background where you feel that if you have wealth, you're obligated to give it charitably. Now, I am a huge proponent of charitable giving, but that doesn't necessarily mean that being wealthy is wrong. For the Christian listeners out there, let's consider the parable that Jesus tells about the talents, where a master gives his servants talents, gives each one of them pools of wealth of varying values, and he leaves. And then the master comes back, and he asks the servants how they did. Well, the first few servants went and invested and multiplied the talents that were given to them, while the last servant took the money, took the talents, buried it in a field, and then dug it up and gave it back without having exercised any stewardship that was expected of him. In response, in the parable, the master takes the money from the servant who didn't do any investing, who didn't do any stewardship other than burying the money out of fear, and gives it to another servant who is very good at investing and managing their money. So this parable goes to show that when we are entrusted with something and we manage it well for God, He will entrust us with more of it. Now, that could be money. It could be other things too. But there are multiple instances I could point out, given enough time in the Bible, where we can see that wealth isn't necessarily wrong. What the Bible does tell us is that the love of money is the root of all evil. So it's not being wealthy per se that's wrong. It's being wealthy for the sake of being wealthy, or being rich for the sake of being rich. Being rich is having a lot of money, while being wealthy is having time. Our goal should be to be wealthy so that we have time, so that we can pursue our calling. If we're coming at this from a faith background, so we can pursue our calling that God gives us. If we are pursuing money for the sake of money, we're putting money in the place where God should live in our life. If we are pursuing wealth so that we can be more of who we already are, if we can be more generous, if we can be a better servant, if we could be a steward who is responsible for more, that's a good thing. Let's jump to the last part of your question, Chris. Is it wrong to have a nice house or a new car? Well, let's consider frugality to answer this particular question. I think frugality has its roots in the Bible. When I developed the definition of frugality, as is defined in the HopeFilled Financial Ministry, the intentional practice of prudent economy, I did a great deal of Bible study, prayer, and reflection in order to come up with that. I found about 30 odd some Bible verses in context that support the idea of pursuing intentional practice of prudent economy. It is a disciplined exercise that has its core in love. Now, exercising the intentional practice of prudent economy when it comes to a car purchase or a house purchase could very well result in a quote-unquote nice house or a nice car given your circumstances. But frugality is going to probably limit you from getting the nicest car or the nicest house, because there are other things we're called to do with our wealth beyond that. There can be a fine line between eating well and being a glutton. Similarly, there can be a fine line between managing our money well and buying things that are appropriate and buying things for the sake of just having the nicest thing. Again, it's like the love of money is the root of all evil, the love of visible wealth and the love of really nice things kind of grows out of that. So you also, when you're buying a nice house and buying a car, think about your motive. Is it something that you want to do to keep up with the Joneses? Is it something because you want to look wealthy? Is it something because that's the lifestyle that you want to be portraying? Or is it because you want a nice home to live in that's going to be reliable, or a nice car to drive that you can trust your life with? I know I may have asked more questions than you did with your question, Chris, but I'm hoping that this answer helps you. Now it's time to jump into the main topic. For today's main topic, we're going to be counting down the top 10 most popular hobbies here in America. Now, this is according to Statistica.com as of March 2023. And here's my goal in going through the top 10 most popular hobbies here in America for the 4th of July. I want to rank them on how frugal they are. Similar to bowling, I cannot look at any of these hobbies and say, oh, this one is clearly going to give the people who engage in this hobby more joy. I'm going to have to assume, for investigating the frugality here, that every hobby that you pursue has the same propensity to give equal happiness. Now, recall frugality, intentional practice of prudent economy. Well, the economy part is going to be maximizing your happiness per dollar. And if happiness is going to be the same across the board, I have to think about these things as which one is going to be possible with the least amount of investment. So I'm going to be looking at it in a way that might come across as, oh, you just don't want me to spend money on these things. But I think it's the only fair way that I can measure the potential level of frugality that can be exercised with a given hobby. Hobbies are something that we intentionally pursue, so I think we can ignore intentionality unless we run into something like gambling, where gambling becomes addictive and sort of overrides our higher brain function and gets us to engage with activity without really thinking about it. Hopefully gambling doesn't show up on the list. Unless I run into a situation like that, I think intentionality can be basically considered equal across all the top 10. And the same thing goes for practice. And that leaves us with prudence. So when it comes to prudence, it's avoiding our exposure to undue risk. So if I have two hobbies that I think have the same propensity for costing the person money, I'm probably going to rank the one which has less risk associated with it as being more frugal. So that's my methodology as we go here. I'm going to sort of be subjective as we run through the list beyond that, but that's how I'm thinking. If you would rank these differently, let me know in the comments. Let's start with 10th most popular hobby in America. 23% of the participants in the Statista study said their favorite hobby was board games or card games. Well, board games and card games, let's think about this. There's not a lot of risk unless we're talking about Monopoly and friendships falling apart. But there's a wide range of investment that could be made here. You could probably try to seek out used games, but in my experience, anytime I've bought a used board game, it's missing pieces and just isn't as fun to play. Cards, on the other hand, can be relatively inexpensive compared to board games, and I've seen some pretty impressive board game collections. While we're talking about board games, my favorite board game growing up would be Stratego. And if I wanted to play with more than one other person, it was going to have to be Clue. I really did enjoy playing Clue. I have to recognize here that certain board games can get really pricey, but that has to be juxtaposed with the fact that cards are relatively inexpensive. I'm going to have to start by giving board games and cards a frugality rating of about 7 out of 10. Next, 24% of participants said that socializing was their favorite hobby. Now, socializing you can engage with pretty much for free. However, socializing results in peer pressure. We've all experienced peer pressure before, and peer pressure can lead to spending money, either due to hosting or being invited over for meals or going out for entertainment. That's not to say those are bad things, but you can feel more pressure to spend money and break your budget spontaneously when you're invited to something unexpected, or when you're out and about with friends and you spontaneously decide to engage with some form of entertainment. That's something that's a little harder to budget for than, say, buying a new board game. But I cannot ignore the fact that you can engage with socializing completely for free, especially if you're really good at saying no and maintaining your relationships. For that reason, I have to give socializing as a hobby an 8 out of 10 for frugality. Tied with socializing, 24% of participants said that gardening or houseplants are their favorite hobby. Now, gardening is going to probably end up costing, in the long run, more than a mild board game hobby, at least in my experience. I know plants can get relatively expensive. They don't necessarily have to be if you keep things small, but I know gardening begets more gardening. My wife recently started a garden in our backyard, and I tell you what, I'm excited. We have some amazing tomato plants out there, and nothing can beat a homegrown tomato. And I guess I got to take that into account. If gardening or plants that are producing food for you or your family are a part of this hobby, well, you're reaping a benefit that you probably can't with board games unless you do tournaments and win money doing them. I think, though, it's a lower risk endeavor with a higher reward for engaging with gardening if you're looking at it from a utility perspective. So I'm going to have to rank this the same as socializing, 8 out of 10. On to number 7. 26% of participants said that their hobby of choice would be DIY arts and crafts. Arts and crafts have a near and dear place in my heart. I've seen some people take junk that they've picked up for free and turn it into gorgeous home decor with a little bit of creativity and ingenuity. Arts and crafts involves a problem solving that I can see the appeal for. And it also isn't something that you have to spend a lot of money on. You can go to craft stores, you can buy a lot of kits, you could really pour in a lot of money into this. However, the DIY side of things, if that's like DIY stuff around the house or making stuff that you could sell, well, there's a lot of opportunity to save money doing stuff yourself. And there's a lot of creativity that can be exercised where you can do arts and crafts for almost nothing. And that gets me excited. Out of my own bias, I'm going to give it a 9 out of 10 for frugality. On to number 6. 28% of participants said that travel was their hobby of choice. Now, I am not one to knock travel. When I was engaged to Amanda, we were engaged long distance. I was about 1,000 miles away as the crow flies, and I traveled to see her at least once a month. I think the month of September in the year we were engaged, I traveled 3 times that month. And I think all of those trips were flights. So while I see that there is an appeal for travel and there's a lot of utility involved with it, I know that it's expensive, especially with gas prices these days. A plane ticket or a car ride is always going to run you money. And when you're traveling, you could feel compelled to engage in activities that cost money if there's something that you can't find near home. I remember when I interned in Dallas, Texas, I really became victim to the food scene out there. Dallas, Texas has some awesome food. Shout out to the Pecan Lodge in particular. Man, that was good. Anyway, traveling is just expensive. I know you can do it on a budget. I know that, I do traveling all the time. It's something you can cut the cost down on, but it's always going to take investment to engage with. There's a reason why traveling is an aspiration for a lot of retired people. And when people are thinking about retirement and they want to travel, it really factors in to thinking about how big their nest egg needs to be. So I'm going to give travel a 5 out of 10 when it comes to frugality. I think that's fair. On to number 5. 31% of participants said that outdoor activities was their hobby of choice. Now, here we have something interesting. There are outdoor activities that cost money, but it is basically free to leave the house and go on a hike if you have hikes or walks or paths near your house. So I'm assuming here that you don't have to travel to engage with your outdoor activities. And if you don't, you can just leave the home and enjoy the beauty of nature surrounding you. I loved living in Utah. The mountains in and around the Salt Lake Valley, simply gorgeous. I didn't run out of waterfalls to see in the 4 years that I lived there. And I don't think it cost me anything other than a handful of sunburns. So outdoor activities gets a 9 out of 10 on the frugality level. I would give it a 10 out of 10, but not everybody lives in a wonderfully diverse outdoor activity area. On to number 4. 32% of participants said that video games was their hobby of choice. Video games, well, you could buy old consoles, you could buy used consoles, you could buy used games and engage with those. They're still going to cost you money. But I remember growing up that my favorite video game console was the Nintendo Wii, and you can pick one of those things up off of eBay for a song now. And those games hold up. The games that are on there, like Super Mario Galaxy or Wii Sports or Wii Play. I did do Wii Fit. That was a fun thing for exercise. Anymore these days, my favorite video game is actually going to be Beat Saber on the PlayStation 4 Pro or whatever VR that you have. Beat Saber is just absolutely the best application for VR when it comes to video games, hands down from my experience. And it's a workout. However, the setup that I have for VR costs nearly $1,000 if you don't count the TV. So video games have the propensity to be very expensive too, especially if you want the latest and greatest, or you want good performance. If you want a PC that can game, you better be willing to put up at least $1,500, I'm pretty sure. Ask Linus Tech Tips about that one. I don't know what a good economy PC is with good game performance anymore with inflation. But just because we can say no to the newest, shiniest, brightest technology, I'm going to give video games a 7 out of 10. Oh, but there are also online games that are really popular like Wordle or Nerdle, which is like Wordle, but a math version. And I kind of like Nerdle more than Wordle, but I do both. And it's something that both my wife's family and my parents really enjoy doing. And it's something that we text about every once in a while. I would give video games a 6 out of 10 if it weren't for the free video games and free game apps that exist out there. So we'll give video games 7 out of 10. Down to the top 3. 36% of participants said that owning pets, is their hobby of choice. Well, some pets are relatively inexpensive. I'm thinking a goldfish, but other pets can be very expensive. I'm thinking cats and dogs, or even an exotic bird. Vets are expensive. Food is expensive. The larger the pet, the more that the pet eats. And if I dive too much into the different costs or expenses or ways to cut costs on pets, I think I'm going to get myself in a lot of trouble with a lot of listeners. So I'm just going to give this a 7 out of 10 and move on without thinking about it too much more. Let's move on to number 2. 36% of participants said that reading was their hobby of choice. Now, I have a very strong bias when it comes to reading because this year it was a New Year's resolution for me to read every morning with my second cup of coffee. And I'm proud to tell you, I think I'm on my 4th book now for the year. And I love reading. It's a great way to grow your knowledge. And it's a great way to reduce your exposure to undue risk, by filling your head with knowledge that you may not otherwise have had before if you read educational material or nonfiction books that help you grow as a person. And the thing is, reading is free. There's plenty of reading to do on the internet, but if you like books, if you want a paper book that smells dusty, you can go to the library, and the library, in a library card, completely free. You don't have to ever buy books in order to engage with reading and growing yourself as a person or growing in knowledge. And because of that, I'm going to give reading the perfect 10 out of 10. Not because it's my hobby that I'm focusing on this year, but because I think that reading is the perfectly frugal hobby. Moving on to the number one answer. 39% of participants said that cooking or baking is their hobby of choice. And I also have a bias towards cooking and baking because, well, when I was younger, and this is going to have to be a story for the podcast at another time, when I was about 14, I taught myself how to cook. It was a combination of seeing my mom cooking growing up to that point and also watching Emeril Lagasse and Elton Brown on the Food Network. I really loved cooking, and I loved baking more than cooking early on. I wanted to write myself the perfect apple pie recipe. Talk about America. Talk about the 4th of July. Nothing more American than apple pie, am I right? So I wanted to make apple pie recipes of my own so I could enter into pie bake-offs. I think I ended up winning 3 or 4 growing up. And it was with a recipe that I wrote from the ground up. I was able to combine the buttery, rich flavors of Italian and French pastries and the beautiful structure of an American pie crust and make a pie crust from scratch that is in a league all of its own. It's incredible. And I tell you what, if you want to make any good pie, any good fruit pie, you take a half cup of cream, a cup of sugar, and then the fruit that you want with any spices, and you put that together, and that makes an excellent filling. Oh, I almost forgot. You got to throw in some sort of thickener like cornstarch or tapioca pearls. But don't use tapioca pearls if you're doing a lattice top because then they get nasty and crunchy. And anyway, I'm talking too much about baking. I love baking. And baking and cooking is a way that you can provide for you and your family in a less expensive way than eating out all the time. So ultimately, cooking and baking is like the epitome of exploring a frugal hobby. It costs money. There's no way around it. You're not going to engage with cooking and baking without spending money. So I can't give it a perfect score. But due to my obvious bias and excitement and foreshadowing of future stories, and the fact that food is what binds all of us as humans together in experience, I'm going to give it a 9 out of 10. Cooking and baking, the most popular hobby in America, gets a 9 out of 10. Second only to reading. Do you agree with my rankings? Would you order them any differently than this? Let me know in the comments below. And until next week, until the next episode of the HopeFilled Financial Podcast, budget bravely and enjoy your hope-filled financial future.